Hello everyone. Welcome to Module 16 in our LPI Security Essentials and CompTIA Security Plus series. Here we're going to have a look at data protection and compliance. Now this is going to be the last main topic in the series. After this there's going to be videos to support your studying and exam taking process. But if you are new to this video, maybe you might want to bookmark the playlist and subscribe so you can play catch up on all the preceding videos. For now, let's get stuck into our first section, data classification, because we need to care about classifying our data to apply the appropriate security controls to it, because not all security controls need to be applied to the data equally. So let's get into it. First of all, let's start out with our data types. So the type categorization is going to be used to help us apply appropriate security so that we can meet compliance requirements that may be applied to the data based on what the data is. And the classification can include data characteristics, structures, and probably most importantly, the intended usage. Some examples would be regulated data. Now, regulated data is probably going to be the most important to pay attention to, as this is any kind of data that is subject to some sort of legal or regulatory compliance requirement, such as personally identifiable information. You might have trade secrets that are unique to your organization in terms of product or service offering, that if that gets leaked, could give your competitors a massive advantage. Then you've got intellectual property, which is even more unique and specific to your particular products and services. However, intellectual property can also cover up-and-coming products or services that you are planning to bring out soon. Then you have legal data, which is obviously any information to do with the organization and the legalities of such a thing. And most obviously financial data, which is all about the monies. Now those data types in place, we are going to further categorize and classify them. Now often for classification, we're going to use the sensitivity or confidentiality of the data to apply appropriate classifications to it. Now we typically encourage 3 to 4 levels of data classification. Any more than that, and you're going to have too many levels, and you're going to spend more time debating and deliberating about which classification applies to this data and not enough time protecting and securing it. So the 3 to 4 levels that I recommend are going to be public, internal, confidential, and restricted. So public data, you don't mind the world seeing it. In fact, you're probably intending the world to see it. In which case, all you're really worried about is integrity and availability of the data. This could be a press release, a product announcement, social media posts, you get the idea. The only thing you really care about is making sure somebody doesn't tamper with it to affect your organization's public image. Internal data, which we used to call private until privacy became a very big concern, and we renamed it internal, is data that stays within the organization. This is the kind of data that is known by all staff members, but doesn't need to be known by the general public. If somebody outside the organization does learn it, it's not a crisis, but it's not a good thing either. And this will vary by organization to organization. An example of this would be maybe the products and technology we use, possibly the organization's hierarchical structure, stuff like that. Then you get to confidential and restricted. Now, confidential data is often used as a classification for the privacy data or the personally identifiable information that we're going to be talking about in a little bit. And it's normally meant for the people that need to know it. So, for instance, your payslip might be considered confidential. You and HR and possibly your line manager are the only ones who really should know about your pay information. However, when it comes to things like pay information, it's up to you whether you share that information with anyone else or not. But because it pertains to you, it's entirely up to you who you share it with. And then you get restricted data. Restricted data is kind of for someone's eyes only, top secret, that kind of thing. It stays amongst only those that need to know it. Now, obviously, other naming conventions may be used for describing these levels, and you could go down to 3 levels. But the idea is that the security is meant to get more strict, the more sensitive or confidential the data is considered to be. After that, we also need to consider data sovereignty. Now, data sovereignty is a legal restriction on where that data can be gathered, stored, processed, and or possibly used. This is normally where a country has legislation that requires that data about its citizens be kept within that country's borders. And organizations that are working with data of other countries' citizens must be mindful of the data sovereignty legislation that may be applicable in that other country. Because even though you're not based in that other country, you are now subject to that country's laws because you are dealing with that country's citizens' data. And you must make sure that your data storage and usage, etc., remains within those boundaries. This also applies to any redundancy as well. So for instance, if you have operations in a country where the sovereignty acts are pretty strict, then you also need to make sure that all your backups, including your offsite backups, stay within that legal jurisdiction. What's normally a very good idea for data sovereignty is to ensure that location metadata is attached to the data to help track and manage your compliance. Because if data gets misclassified as being from another country, you might accidentally violate the data sovereignty regulations and requirements without realizing it. So location metadata does become very, very useful for this. Now for a very, very heavy topic, privacy data. When it comes to privacy data, we are talking about any kind of private data or personally identifiable information. Now, the definitions for what is private data or personally identifiable information will vary around the world. But a good rule of thumb that I have for you is that if the data can be used to impersonate that individual, be it online or in the real world, it is considered PII or privacy data. Now, privacy laws are going to exist to protect that data. Now, they're there to prevent infringement on the individual's rights when it comes to that data being mishandled or exposed. Privacy laws do not prohibit the collection and the processing and the storage of personally identifiable information. They regulate it and deal with repercussions if mishandled. That's worth understanding. So, let's talk about some of the legal implications. You've got to make sure that you've got protection of that private data on a local, national, and international level. And compliance is expected at all 3 levels. Please be aware that a different country's privacy laws can apply to your organization if you process, store, or use any data from that country's citizens. For instance, you've got the GDPR regulations from the European Union. Even if you're not based in the EU, you might be subject to GDPR if you have data about an EU citizen in your systems. And the thing is, non-compliance with these standards can lead to very expensive and damaging fines or penalties. For instance, with GDPR, the way it's worded, it's a percentage of revenue or a certain amount per violation, whichever is the higher of the two. And believe you me, you don't hear that type of wording, the higher of the two, very often when it comes to any sort of fines or penalties. So these implications can be very severe if you're not compliant. Now, in terms of what you need to do for compliance, that will depend on a lot of factors. Where are you based? Where are these people's that data you're storing coming from? What laws and legislations are you subject to? What are you doing with that data? What's the main goal of having that data? It's a whole lot of concerns that you need to look into and figure out how it applies to you and your organization. But another key thing about privacy data and a lot of these legislations is a lot of them cover something called the right to be forgotten. The right to be forgotten is basically where an individual has the ability and right to request and receive acknowledgement that their PII data has been deleted under legislatively defined circumstances. Moving along. We also need to talk a little bit about ownership of privacy data, because ownership of privacy data is weird. The traditional concepts of ownership does not apply when it comes to things like PII or private data. So we've got some key terms that you need to know about. So first of all, you've got the data subject. This is normally the individual to whom the data relates to or pertains to. So for instance, data about you, you are the subject of that data. Data about me, I am the subject of that data. But then, when that data is taken by another organization and used, you've got the data controller, custodian, or processor. Now, depending on legislation and the specific organization's operations, these roles might become more precise and specific, but generally it does apply to the organization that is storing and using the data. Obviously, the specific laws will define exactly what is and who is the controller, what is and who is the custodian, and what is and who is the processor. Your data protection laws are normally focused on the data subject and place the requirements on the organization for compliance. Then, the privacy legislations you'll deal with also talk about data retention, which can be a very interesting thing to look at. Data retention focuses on how long are you allowed to store that personally identifiable information for. The focus is usually minimal retention. Basically, you're only allowed to keep somebody's private data for as long as you have a business requirement and necessity to keep it. Now, this can lead to some interesting challenges when it comes to retention requirements from other legislation and requirements. For example, you might have financial record retention requirements for tax purposes or something like that, or maybe something to do with security and counterterrorism and stuff like that, which might require storage of a person's PII for a longer period of time. So it's quite tricky to balance the requirements of both legislations. Generally, I suggest that you do seek legal counsel whenever you do run into these situations when you're not sure whether you should keep this for really long or for really short, depending on which legal obligation you want to be compliant with. As I'm not a lawyer, and probably you aren't either, so I suggest seek legal counsel. And the privacy legislations that we have to be compliant with and be considerate towards often also do address things like what happens during a privacy data breach. Now, a breach is considered to be any situation where PII data has been read, modified, or deleted without appropriate authorization by, most importantly, the data subject, but also the data custodian. Now, an organization may be required to issue a notice of the breach, either to the specifically affected individuals or a full-on public announcement. Now, both of which are going to be quite problematic because with the affected individuals, it just takes one of them to tweet about it or post on its social media in some way, and then it becomes a public announcement. So even if you don't have to do a public announcement, it might be in your best interest as an organization to do it anyway, because at some point it will become public knowledge and then it's going to be reputation control. It's going to suck either way, but rather be the organization that comes clean with something and does garner a little bit more trust and confidence from their customers than seem to be the organization trying to keep a lid on the data breach. Now, the consequences for the organization failing to protect personally identifiable or privacy data is the following stuff. Obviously, reputational damage, as we previously mentioned. There could also be identity theft of those individuals whose private data has been stolen. And please be aware, it's not just the customers, but also the staff members as well that could be subject to a privacy data breach and have their identity stolen. There could also be intellectual property theft, which means somebody loses the rights to the hard work and creative endeavor they've been putting a lot of effort into. And obviously, fines and penalties, depending on how the breach occurred and whether it was something that you should have been doing to prevent it and you fell short with that. I would suggest that you always try and focus on your auditing to ensure that you are compliant with legal requirements so that you minimize the chance of any penalties or fines, or at least if you can't prevent them, that you decrease how significant and impactful they'll be to you and the organization. Now, something that will help with this is to look at data protection and data loss prevention services. This is where an organization will go about implementing appropriate data protection controls for data in all of its key states, whether that be data at rest in storage somewhere, data in motion traveling through the network somewhere, or data in use, currently sitting on a system being processed by either the CPU or just chilling out in RAM. Now, we will require security controls for all three. The obvious answer for data at rest and data in motion, as we've mentioned in a previous video, is encryption. Data in use, you've got to look at things like access control, authorization, data enclaves, and stuff like that. But I want to jump to the DLP stuff. A data loss prevention system or service is a monitoring, alerting, and possibly intervening service that can help autonomously detect and block a data loss or data breach event from taking place. Now, these systems can be very complex to implement and will need continual refinement. Very much like a SIEM, actually. In fact, you might even find that your SIEM actually does have a DLP feature built into it, so worth looking into. But when it comes to implementing both a SIEM and a DLP, they're very similar in that they're going to monitor for events and activities occurring and autonomously alert you and possibly even prevent an action from happening anymore until approved of by an appropriate security professional. However, I would suggest as an organization, get a SIEM deployed first. Both a DLP and a SIEM are very challenging to implement, but with a SIEM, you're going to have more challenges if it's the first time you're doing this, but the SIEM does add a lot more value to your security posture than a DLP system will. And a lot of the lessons you learn while deploying that SIEM will actually translate to your deployment of a DLP service. So I'd suggest get the SIEM done first and then a DLP if it's not already a feature of your SIEM. That way, with the narrower scope and benefit the DLP system offers you, you'll have an easier time deploying it and see greater value with it, as you will not be learning the hard lessons that you learned while deploying the SIEM. But please appreciate that it does take time to get it up and running and working effectively, and it will require continual refinement as operations, systems, and data types change. Then, moving along to personnel policies. Policies and processes that will help encourage better security out of your users. So first, let's talk about behavior and conduct policies. These are policies that are going to govern and define how your employees are meant to conduct themselves and their operations in a secure manner. We've touched on a few of these already, so some of them we'll breeze through quite quickly. Such as the acceptable use policy, which is going to outline what is and is not acceptable use of company computing resources. Please do yourself a favor and use the term resources, as that will be all-encompassing of both traditional IT assets, as well as things like cloud services, the network, virtual machines, storage, etc. It would also be a good idea as well to define the reporting process for violations of the acceptable use policy, and when to notify law enforcement if the unacceptable usage is a legal issue. Then a code of conduct would be a very good idea as well. Now, this is not purely about how the person dresses, whether they're hygienic or not, or stuff like that, although that is good for the organization's image, but in terms of how an employee discusses things with the customer, the general public, with their friends and family, to ensure that there is minimal information being disclosed about the organization and its sensitive operations to outsiders who have no need or right to know. Please be aware that this policy will not always be completely enforceable, as you cannot control what somebody tells their spouse in the privacy of their bedroom. Next up is a policy around social media usage. Again, you can't stop somebody from using their private social media account on their own device, using their own internet connection in their own time. What you can do, though, is govern what they're allowed to post about the workplace and encourage a minimization of data. I normally encourage that people put as little information about their current job responsibilities online as possible, unless they're job hunting, in which case then obviously it does benefit that person to have that information online, such as LinkedIn. But I still heavily suggest that unless they're job hunting, they keep their responsibilities, duties, and activities to a minimum when it comes to what they post about their work on social media. Another interesting set of policies to look at is policies pertaining to personally owned devices. We've already touched on the bring your own device policy, which is going to affect how somebody's personal smartphone or tablet or laptop may be used for work purposes. But something that we didn't touch on clearly is maybe a policy to deal with personal devices at work. Now, when it comes to these personal devices at work, I'm describing devices that are owned by the employee, but not used for work in any way. They're just at work with the person. So, for instance, someone's personal smartphone with absolutely nothing of the workplace on it. No email, no instant messaging, no meeting apps, nothing to do with work. You need to govern how that device is allowed to be used at work, because somebody could easily use the camera on their personal phone to take photos of a sensitive document, circumventing the ability for something like a data loss prevention system to detect that employee trying to exfiltrate that data. Another policy as well that needs to be looked at is your clean desk policy. This is not a new policy, as it's always been around for when it comes to things like a physical desk. What documents, papers, and files do you leave on your desk at work? The idea is that you should leave as little as possible open and only have what you need for your work at the time there. And when you're not at your desk, that you've packed that stuff away and locked it up nice and safe. But what does need to be updated is the approach to how it handles the computer desktop. What files do you leave on the desktop? What files do you leave open on the screen, especially if you've got a multi-monitor setup? Because you can never be quite sure who is looking at what you're doing, especially considering how a lot of monitors have very, very good and wide viewing angles that could allow somebody to very easily shoulder surf without you realizing they're behind you. So that does need to be taken into account. And then linking that up to what we previously mentioned about somebody taking a photograph, smartphones have really good cameras now with some surprisingly great zoom capabilities. So yeah, people need to be more cognizant of what they have open on the computer while they're using it, and most importantly, on maybe a display that they're not paying full attention to, and most obviously when they're not at the computer. Then another important set of policies and procedures to look at is user training. The reason why user training is so important is because your users are not always going to be tech savvy or security conscious, especially when understanding technology and managing technology is not within their job requirements, or being cognizant of cybersecurity is not a big thing in their role. So this is why we need training and awareness programs to help with this. Now, firstly, we suggest training programs to help get people to understand what they should be doing for cybersecurity. So let's have some advice on how to best conduct these training programs. Firstly, run them regularly, because this is going to be to help keep people who are not tech or security conscious up to speed on this. You need to do it regularly, as they will forget about it as the stresses and requirements of their existing job function keep taking away from their ability to remember what's the right and wrong thing to do when it comes to security. We also suggest that you group the users based on their job role. It's a lot easier to keep people engaged when everyone's in the same job role, because you can tailor the training around the job role so that they're engaged, they're paying attention, and they're getting value. Don't try and mix up the group and train different types of users. I have seen this myself, where you'll have people from sales, operations, shipping, IT, the senior executives, all sitting in the same training session. And for the trainer, it's a nightmare, because they've got to try and figure out how to make sure the content appeals to everybody and keeps everyone engaged. Because while you're telling something that makes sense to the executives and has got them interested in, the people that are responsible for like product delivery or operation management, they might be not paying attention and losing focus and not getting full value out of the training intervention. So do yourself a favor and tailor it around the group and make sure that it's engaging. One of the things that helps engage people is you tell them the why they need to do something or why they shouldn't do something, in addition to the what they should and should not be doing. Because when people understand the consequences of the activity, they're more likely to listen. Imagine it's a toddler trying to touch the pot on the stove. You tell the kid, don't touch that, you'll burn yourself. If the child has never burnt themselves before, they don't fully understand the ramifications of that warning. But when they have burnt themselves before, and you say, don't do that, you'll burn yourself, the kid remembers and understands what that warning means. Now, I'm not saying you must treat the users like toddlers, because they are adults and they are able to conceptualize repercussions without having experienced them before, unlike a toddler. If you tell the person that, hey, look, if you leave your computer unlocked and unattended, this is what can happen. This is why you need to make sure you're locking your computer. This is why you have to have a two-factor authentication applied to you to make it harder for attackers to access your account. This is why you need to speak up whenever you notice something weird happening on your system and you think it might be security related. When you tell people why, they actually internalize that information a lot more, and they'll probably walk away from that training experience with better practices ingrained in them. And then to keep this going, have some awareness programs running as well, because you can run awareness programs more regularly than you can training intervention. Things like email newsletters, posters, stuff like that can be used to just keep cybersecurity in the forefront of people's minds as much as you can. And we do suggest that you do change your awareness program methods on the regular so that you minimize boredom and disengagement. By keeping that awareness program different on a regular basis, like moving from newsletters to posters after a few months, and then maybe going back to newsletters at some point in the future, you're going to have people being more thoughtful about cybersecurity. But also, whatever you do, like especially newsletters and maybe some self-paced videos that they watch, keep it brief. The shorter it is, the more straightforward it is, the more likely the person is to read it, engage with it, watch it, whatever, and remember it, than if it's a lengthy, long thing. Remember, people have very short attention spans nowadays. So you need to try and keep it quick, engaging, and as enjoyable as possible, especially when it's something the employee is not looking forward to. Another cool thing you can also look at doing with both your training and your awareness programs is making it fun. I hate using the buzzword, but try and gamify the cybersecurity practices. Have quizzes so that people can compare scores or get badges and medals and stuff like that. I know it sounds trivial and juvenile and stuff like that, but it actually does work because there is an internal satisfaction getting a point, getting a badge, getting a high score, seeing your name on a leaderboard or something like that. It is kind of cool. And it does help, again, get better engagement. And the engagement is what's going to help because the person will walk away with something sticking in their mind. They'll remember, hey, I got that badge. Why did I get that badge? Oh yeah, because I fully understand what I need to do with regards to ensuring my passwords are good. That kind of stuff works well. Now, some suggestions for topics that your training programs and your awareness programs should probably cover should be things like situational awareness, both in the physical world and online, especially online, because a lot of people seem to think that the same threats and dangers that apply in the physical world don't apply online. For instance, I might know as an employee I should be careful about what I say about the workplace when I'm out having coffee or lunch with my co-workers in public because I don't know who's listening. But online, I might be discussing on WhatsApp or some other instant messaging platform that other people could see. So you need to teach people that the same kinds of concerns need to be taken into consideration when they're online as if they were in the physical world. Another important topic to consider is reporting and escalation processes for people to bring attention to cybersecurity. Because although your employees will always be one of the weakest links in your cybersecurity, they can also become a very valuable asset if they are able to speak up about something weird. Something as simple as somebody coming into the office and seeing a bunch of furniture has been moved. Now, that furniture might have been moved intentionally as part of a bit of an office redesign, or it could have been an attacker planting some rogue hardware and not repositioning the furniture exactly where it was. Either way, the employee should feel confident to report that concern and escalate it to the security team. Rather have a false alarm than somebody thinking, oh, it's probably nothing, and it actually does turn out to be an indicator that there's an attack or there has been previous compromise taking place. Also, train people on the policies that they are subject to, especially the ones that have the biggest impact on cybersecurity. But whatever you do, try and make sure that the training and awareness on the policy is easy and quick. Don't make it a case of somebody sitting there and reading the policy verbatim to someone, because that's going to get very boring and very disengaging very quickly. Because if the person hasn't read the policy on their own, they're probably not going to enjoy having it forced on them word for word. So try and make it simple, straightforward, and get them to appreciate the common sense. that the policy is probably dealing with when it comes to cybersecurity. Now, when I say common sense, please understand, for you and I it's common sense, but for users it might not be. Also, train them on insider threats, how to recognize an insider threat and what to do about it. That way somebody might notice the devilish behavior of a malicious insider. As I've mentioned previously, password practices would be a very good idea to train people on, as one of the things that is fully within a user's control for cybersecurity is choosing a good password. Just because a password meets complexity requirements doesn't make it a good password. For instance, if my password is capital P A $W0RD, it's 8 characters, it's uppercase, lowercase letters, it's numbers and special characters, but it's still a terrible password because it's literally me just complexifying the word password. So teach your users about these best practices so that they understand why certain things are a bad idea for passwords. And they'll probably start taking it a bit more seriously and coming up with better passwords. Also, train your users on things like the dangers of removable media and now USB cables, as both of which can be used maliciously. Removable media can be used as a rubber ducky or contain malware, and USB cables can sometimes be malicious now, either injecting data into the peripheral like the smartphone or the tablet, or into the computer into which it is plugged. So teach people about the dangers of using unknown removable media and cables. Also, do some training and awareness programs on the dangers and risks of hybrid and remote work environments, as it's a lot easier for attackers to maybe compromise a home network and gain access to the employee's work machine if the employee has not taken their home network security seriously. And also, maybe train the employee on some social engineering techniques so that they better understand how the social engineering goes down and they become less likely to fall victim to it. Give them some examples, give them some use cases, maybe even get them to role play it a little bit. Could be making it a bit of fun there. But when you are planning to do training and awareness programs, you need to understand there's a life cycle to make sure this works effectively. As we said, this needs to be done regularly, so we know we're never done with this. We're just done with the current cycle. So what does the cycle look like? Well, it looks like this. We start out with assessing the needs of this training or awareness program. What are your biggest shortfalls with user behavior and security? And what can you do to start fixing that? What do you know? With working out what you can do to start fixing that, you've moved into the planning and the design phase of your training or awareness intervention. Once you've started planning and designing how you're going to do this, you can start developing the content or the training around what you need it to achieve. Then you go into the delivery and implementation of the training and or awareness program, where you get the employees to engage with it or attend the training, and you get feedback from both the employees, the users, and their managers, as well as the security personnel who can make a note of the change or impact that the training may have had on the people's behavior and practices. Consider how you're going to reinforce that training and awareness. This is one of the reasons why we speak about having an awareness program with training, because one training intervention is great, but reminding the people about the things they were trained on in a few weeks' time or a few months' time with a newsletter or a top 10 list or something like that via email could work wonders. Then look at their behavior again and see if the reinforcement is helping, and then you go into assessing again. What could be improved? What needs revisiting? What new concerns have we discovered that need to be addressed? And we do the cycle all over again. Another reason for always doing the cycle on the regular is because you also might have people joining the organization just after you finished a training or awareness cycle, and they missed out on it entirely. So it is an amazingly valuable, low-tech, moderate-cost solution to the risks and dangers that your users do introduce into the workplace. But that is all I have for you in this one. Yes, it was a short video compared to previous ones, as a lot of the topics we have spoken about already, like the privacy data, we were just further underlining and highlighting the importance of making sure you apply appropriate data controls to stuff. And we have mentioned policies before already, and the training, it was just a nice little discussion about why it matters and why you should consider getting this done. Alright, but I would like to first of all thank you for watching. I do appreciate it, As I said in the beginning of this video, this is the last main topic video of the LPI Security Essentials and CompTIA Security Plus series. The future videos are going to be around supporting you when it comes to studying for and passing the exams. So for that, you might want to subscribe so that you don't miss out, and maybe even bookmark this playlist somehow so you can always come back to it later. Again, thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next video.